Hey everyone. I'm not the type to spill my personal life on the internet, but I honestly don't know where else to go with this. My name's Calvin, I'm 31, and I run my own gym. Fitness has always been my escape. My way to work through stress, focus my mind, and feel like I have control over something. The gym became my second home, and eventually, I made it my career. It wasn't easy to get where I am, but it felt worth it because I thought I was building something solid. Not just for me but for my wife, Meg, too. Meg and I met at a fitness expo 5 years ago. She was standing by a protein bar vendor, laughing at some over-the-top pitch from one of the reps. I remember thinking how natural she was, like the world lit up around her without her even trying. We got to talking, and before I knew it, we were swapping numbers. A few dates later, I was hooked. She was passionate about health and fitness, just like me. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. When we got married, it felt like life was finally coming together. She started working out at my gym shortly after we tied the knot. At first, it was great. She was my biggest cheerleader. I'd create special programs for her, mixing up workouts so she stayed motivated and challenged. She loved it, or at least she said she did. We'd joke around between her sets, and I felt like we were not just husband and wife but partners in this dream I had worked so hard for. But things started to change. Slowly, in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. She began chatting with the guys at the gym more than usual. Not just polite small talk, which I didn't mind. It's good for business when members feel welcome, but it was different. She was laughing louder, lingering longer. I'd be mid-session with a client, glancing over to see her in the corner, leaning into some guy's conversation with this light in her eyes. It wasn't the look she used to save for me. I told myself I was overthinking it. She's friendly, I thought. That's just who she is. But it didn't stop there. After her workouts, she used to wait for me to finish up so we could head home together. Now, she started leaving on her own, saying she didn't want to interrupt me while I worked. I'd catch her glancing at her phone more often during her sets, texting someone with a little smirk on her face. I asked her once who she was chatting with, and she just laughed it off, saying it was nothing important. Then there was the night everything really shifted for me. I was wrapping up a late session with one of my regulars, and Meg came up to me as I was shutting down for the night. She told me her workout had run longer than expected and not to wait for her, she'd call a cab home. Something about the way she said it threw me off. She wasn't her usual bubbly self. Her tone was clipped, almost rehearsed, like she'd been practicing the line in her head. I didn't argue. I figured maybe she just needed some space, or maybe I was just imagining things. So, I finished closing up and headed home. I kept checking my phone, expecting her to text me when she got back. Hours passed, and it was getting late. I stepped out to the porch, and that's when I saw it. A sleek black luxury car pulling up to our driveway. It wasn't a cab. I watched as the driver, a guy in his late 30s with a crisp suit and confident smile, opened the door for Meg. She stepped out, laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his shoulder lightly as she thanked him. My stomach turned. I stayed hidden in the shadow of the porch, frozen, watching her walk to the door like it was just another night. When I confronted her later, she didn't even flinch. She claimed it was Tristan, an old acquaintance from her college days who'd recently joined my gym. Apparently, he'd finished his workout at the same time she had and offered to give her a lift. She acted like it was the most logical thing in the world. Her tone was calm, her face completely unbothered. She even threw in a line about how she didn't want me to worry about her safety. But something about it didn't sit right. Her explanation was too smooth, too polished. I know her well enough to pick up when she's hiding something. It felt like she was daring me to believe her. I let it go that night, but inside, I knew this wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it. After that first night with the black car, the nagging feeling didn't go away. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that maybe I was just being insecure. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Meg had never acted like this before. So secretive, so distant. Every time I replayed her explanation in my head, it felt more rehearsed. If it was so innocent, why did she sound like she was reading a script? The days after that night were tense. At least for me. Meg acted like everything was fine, like we were back to normal. She was on her phone a lot, though. Not in an obvious way, she was smarter than that. It was subtle. She'd glance down at her phone while I was talking to her, typing quickly and tucking it away if I got too close. When I asked her who she was texting, she'd shrug and say, "Just a friend," or "Nothing important." At the gym, it was more of the same. She didn't stick to her routine anymore. Instead of following the program I designed for her, she seemed more interested in hanging around. She'd chat with people, drift from one area to another, and laugh at conversations I couldn't hear. It wasn't like she was doing anything blatantly wrong, but I couldn't ignore the way my gut churned when I saw her talking to certain guys, especially Tristan. Tristan wasn't the kind of guy you could ignore. He had that confident, polished look, like someone who stepped out of a fitness catalog. His workouts were more about looking good than actually breaking a sweat, but he knew how to command attention. I'd catch him glancing at Meg occasionally, his smile a little too familiar, and she didn't exactly look uncomfortable. The next Friday came, and I could already feel the tension building. The gym was quieter than usual that evening, with most of the regulars heading home early. I was finishing up paperwork in the office when I realized Meg was still out on the floor. Normally, she'd come find me when she was done, but tonight she was nowhere in sight. When I stepped out, I saw her sitting on a bench near the weight racks, scrolling through her phone. I asked if she was ready to leave, and she looked up, startled, like she wasn't expecting me. She hesitated, then said she wanted to finish her cool-down and told me to head home without her. "I'll call a cab," she said again, just like last time. I should have stayed. I knew I should have. But something in her tone, firm, almost dismissive, made me feel like I'd come off as insecure if I insisted. So I left, even though everything in me was screaming not to. When I got home, I couldn't sit still. I kept pacing the house, checking my phone every few minutes. Hours passed, and just like before, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked through the blinds, and there it was, the same sleek black car. Tristan. I watched as Meg stepped out, her laughter floating through the still night air. She leaned into the window, saying something to him, and he laughed back before driving off. My hands clenched into fists as I stood there, hidden in the shadows. She walked up to the door with that same casual ease, like there was nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't say anything that night. I couldn't. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while she slept beside me like it was any other day. But I knew it wasn't. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, Meg acted like nothing had happened. She was cheerful, humming as she made coffee, scrolling through her phone like usual. If she noticed the way I was watching her, she didn't let it show. I wanted to ask her about the night before, about Tristan, the car, everything, but I didn't. Not yet. I needed more. If I confronted her without proof, I knew how she'd spin it. She'd laugh it off, call me paranoid, and somehow make me feel like the bad guy for questioning her. Instead, I decided to watch and wait. At the gym that day, my attention wasn't on my clients. I couldn't focus, not when Tristan walked in like clockwork, his usual confident stride making it clear he felt at home. He nodded at a few people and started his routine, but I noticed his eyes darting around like he was scanning the room. When Meg walked in about 15 minutes later, his face lit up, just for a moment, but enough to set my nerves on edge. I tried to act normal, keeping an eye on them from across the gym while pretending to tidy up equipment. They didn't go straight to each other, but there was this unspoken energy, like they were waiting for the right moment. Sure enough, after Meg finished her warm-up, she wandered over to the corner where Tristan was stretching. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language said enough. She laughed at something, lightly touching her neck the way she did when she was flirting. Tristan leaned in just slightly, like he was telling her something only she was supposed to hear. It was like a punch to the gut. I wanted to walk over there and say something, anything, to break whatever was happening between them. But I didn't. I told myself I needed to stay calm, that making a scene wouldn't help. Instead, I grabbed a towel, wiped down a nearby machine, and forced myself to look away. The rest of the day felt like a blur. I don't even remember half the conversations I had with my clients. All I could think about was what I'd seen. It wasn't innocent. I knew that much. But I still didn't have solid proof, nothing concrete enough to confront her with. Later that evening, I tried to act normal when we got home. We ate dinner in front of the TV, Meg scrolling through her phone between bites while I sat in silence. Every now and then, I'd glance at her, wondering what was going on in her head. Did she feel guilty? Or did she think she was getting away with it? At one point, her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she typed out a quick reply. I asked her casually who it was, and she waved me off. "Just a friend," she said, not even looking up. I nodded, pretending to accept it, but inside, I felt the anger bubbling up again. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed up, pacing the living room. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Confronting her without more proof felt pointless. But sitting back and doing nothing? That wasn't an option either. Eventually, I decided on a plan. The next time Tristan was at the gym, I'd stick close. No more keeping my distance. No more second-guessing myself. If they thought they could do whatever this was right under my nose, they were about to find out otherwise. The next day, I went into the gym with a purpose. I didn't tell Meg about the suspicions eating away at me or the plan I'd cooked up while pacing the house last night. Instead, I played along, keeping up the facade that everything was normal. But inside, I was watching her every move. Meg arrived a little later than usual, walking in with a lightness in her step like she didn't have a care in the world. She greeted me with a quick smile before heading to her usual corner to warm up. I watched her out of the corner of my eye while pretending to organize weights. Sure enough, not long after, Tristan strolled in, right on schedule. He didn't head straight to the equipment this time. Instead, he lingered near the front desk, chatting with one of the staff. From where I stood, it looked casual, but I could tell he was waiting. His eyes kept darting to the floor where Meg was stretching. She hadn't noticed him, or at least she pretended not to, but it wasn't long before she casually turned her warm-up in his direction. I decided I wasn't going to stay on the sidelines today. Grabbing a clipboard, I made my way over, checking machines as if I was doing maintenance. I worked my way closer, staying within earshot but not enough to seem obvious. If there was something going on, I wasn't going to miss it. Tristan was the one to approach her this time, his confident swagger making it look like he owned the place. He leaned on a nearby rack, saying something that made Meg laugh, louder than she normally did. That laugh, it wasn't the kind you give to just anyone. She used to laugh like that when we first started dating. I forced myself to keep my cool, focusing on adjusting the nearby equipment as I strained to hear their conversation. Their voices were low, but I caught bits and pieces. Tristan was asking about her workout, throwing in a compliment about her form. She brushed it off with a wave of her hand but smiled anyway, a little too wide for my liking. Then, almost as if they sensed I was close, their tones shifted. Meg straightened up, moving into a casual stretch, and Tristan suddenly turned his attention to a dumbbell rack as if he'd been planning to grab weights all along. I acted like I hadn't noticed and walked past them, clipboard in hand, giving Tristan a curt nod. His response was polite but quick, his gaze flicking between me and Meg. The rest of their interaction seemed more careful after that. They kept their distance but still threw glances at each other when they thought no one was looking. Meg finished her session not long after, saying she was heading home early to get some errands done. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, but I couldn't help but notice the way Tristan watched her leave. The whole day left me on edge. There was no outright proof, no smoking gun, but I knew what I saw. The way they acted around each other wasn't normal. Not for two people who were supposedly just gym acquaintances. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I sat in bed, scrolling through my phone while Meg lay beside me, already asleep. My mind raced with everything I'd observed that day, every smile, every lingering glance. It was all adding up to something I couldn't ignore. Whatever this was, it wasn't innocent. I knew I needed to dig deeper, and I wasn't going to stop until I had the answers. The tension in my gut didn't ease up, not after watching them at the gym, not after the way Meg left early. I spent the next couple of days hyper-aware of every interaction, every little move she made. I hated feeling like this, paranoid, distrustful, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was just one step behind her and Tristan, like they were playing a game and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. The gym became my battlefield. I made it a point to be everywhere, watching without being obvious. Tristan's patterns were predictable. He'd show up late in the afternoon, stay for about an hour, and then linger around the front like he was waiting for something. Meg's schedule started to shift too. She used to come in the mornings or early evenings, but now her workouts often overlapped with his. Coincidence? I didn't think so. Then came the slip-up. It was a Thursday evening, and the gym was unusually quiet. Most of the regulars had finished their sessions and gone home, leaving just a handful of people scattered across the floor. Meg was doing her usual routine, but her movements seemed distracted. She kept glancing at the clock, like she was counting down to something. Around 7:30, Tristan showed up. Late, even for him. He walked in, nodded at me, and headed straight for the weights without the usual small talk at the desk. That alone caught my attention. It was like he had tunnel vision, no distractions, no lingering. Just a direct line to the free weights, which, coincidentally, were right near where Meg was working out. I moved to the far side of the gym, pretending to check equipment while keeping them in my line of sight. They didn't talk at first, just exchanged a glance. But it wasn't long before Tristan found his way over to her station. He made a comment, I couldn't hear what, but it made Meg smile, that same smile I'd seen too many times in the last few weeks. Then it happened. Tristan's phone buzzed, and he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. He chuckled softly, and before slipping it back into his pocket, I caught a glimpse of something on the screen, a name. Maggie. I froze. Maggie. She never went by that name unless it was with old friends or family. It wasn't her professional name, not the one she used at the gym or even on social media. The fact that it popped up on his phone hit me like a brick to the chest. I didn't let on that I saw anything, but my mind was racing. What reason could she have to text him? What could they possibly need to talk about outside the gym? I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm, but I knew this was it. My first real crack at the truth. When Tristan left the gym later, I watched him closely. He didn't glance back, didn't hesitate as he walked out the door. Meg stayed behind, finishing her workout like nothing was out of the ordinary. But I couldn't unsee it, the name on his phone, the way they acted when they thought no one was paying attention. That night, I barely slept. The image of Tristan's phone burned in my mind, along with 1,000 questions I didn't have answers to. Whatever was happening between them, it wasn't just casual. It was personal. And I was done playing the clueless husband. It was time to act. After seeing her name on Tristan's phone, everything clicked. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on between them wasn't just some casual gym friendship. It was deliberate, and it was personal. They were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, not between a married woman and another man, and especially not in my gym. The next day, I kept my distance from Meg. I needed time to think, to figure out my next step without tipping her off. She acted normal, like nothing had happened, like she wasn't texting another man or exchanging secretive glances when she thought I wasn't looking. Her confidence was almost unsettling, as if she believed I'd never catch on. But I had caught on. I just needed proof. That evening, I stayed late at the gym, using the excuse of inventory to keep an eye on things. Meg had finished her workout earlier in the day, so I wasn't expecting her to show up. Around 8 p.m., the place was winding down. Just a few people left doing their routines. I was about to call it a night when Tristan walked in. Something about the way he carried himself was different this time. He wasn't in his usual gym gear. Instead, he was dressed casually, like he wasn't planning to work out. He nodded at me in passing, heading straight for the locker room without saying a word. My gut told me to stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the front desk, pretending to sort paperwork, but really, I was watching the locker room door. About 5 minutes later, Meg walked in. I froze. She wasn't in her gym clothes either, just leggings and a hoodie, like she wasn't planning to stay long. Her eyes darted around the gym as she walked toward the locker room. She didn't notice me standing at the desk, or if she did, she didn't let it show. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I gave it a minute, then quietly followed. The locker room was dead silent when I stepped in, except for the faint sound of voices coming from the far side. The showers. My stomach churned as I moved closer, staying out of sight. The voices got louder, her voice, his voice, low, but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone said enough. It wasn't casual. It wasn't professional. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, torn between storming in and walking away. Every fiber of my being wanted to confront them, to demand answers, to make them face the consequences of whatever this was. But I held back. If I went in now, they'd deny everything. I needed proof, something undeniable. Then, as if fate decided to intervene, I heard the unmistakable sound of Tristan's phone buzzing. A moment later, the voices quieted, and I saw Tristan step out of the shower area, phone in hand. He didn't see me, too busy checking his screen. I ducked into a corner, heart racing, and watched as he tossed his phone onto a bench before heading back toward the shower. This was it. My chance. I hesitated for a split second, then stepped forward and grabbed his phone. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the screen. It didn't even have a passcode. The messages were right there, open for me to see. The first thing I noticed was the name at the top. Maggie. I didn't need to read far before my suspicions were confirmed. The messages weren't innocent, not by a long shot. One of the most recent ones sent my stomach into freefall. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. I scrolled further, my blood boiling as I read more. Explicit photos, videos, messages from Meg or Maggie, or whoever she thought she was when she was with him. There was no denying it now. They'd crossed every line imaginable. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my mind spinning. I couldn't confront them yet, not here, not now. But I had what I needed. The truth was no longer something I suspected. It was something I knew. When I got home that night, Meg was already in bed, her face calm, peaceful, like she didn't have a care in the world. I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the wall, the weight of what I'd discovered crushing me. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was war. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only comes from being pushed to your absolute limit. The messages on Tristan's phone had burned themselves into my mind. Every word, every image, was a reminder of how far this betrayal had gone. Meg wasn't just lying to me, she was living an entirely separate life, one that had no room for me in it. I couldn't even look at her during breakfast. She sat across from me, scrolling through her phone like it was any other day. The sound of her spoon clinking against her bowl made my jaw tighten. I wanted to grab the phone out of her hand, slam it down, and force her to explain herself. But instead, I stayed quiet. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. At the gym, I felt like I was walking through a haze. I went through the motions with my clients, nodded along to conversations I wasn't really hearing, and forced myself to smile when people asked if I was okay. All the while, my mind was racing. I had the proof, but now I needed a plan. By late afternoon, Meg showed up at the gym like clockwork. She breezed in with her usual energy, flashing me a quick smile before heading to the floor. I watched her start her workout, wondering how she could act so carefree. How could she stand there, laughing and chatting with people, knowing what she was doing behind my back? Then, as if on cue, Tristan walked in. He spotted her almost immediately and headed to a station not far from hers. They didn't speak right away, but the connection was there. The way their eyes met, the small smile she gave him before turning back to her workout. My stomach twisted. How long had this been going on? How many nights had she lied to my face while running off to meet him? I decided I couldn't wait any longer. After Tristan left the gym, I pulled Meg aside. I told her I'd noticed she'd been spending a lot of time around Tristan lately and asked if there was something I needed to know. She didn't flinch. Instead, she rolled her eyes, saying I was being ridiculous. She claimed he was just someone she ran into at the gym, someone she barely knew outside of casual conversations during workouts. Her tone was smooth, too smooth. I could see the cracks in her story even as she spoke. Every word felt calculated, designed to throw me off balance. But I didn't let it show. I nodded, acting like I believed her, even though my blood was boiling inside. That evening, I followed her home again. She insisted she needed to stay late, finishing her workout and catching up on cardio. I knew better. When she didn't show up for hours, I parked around the corner from our house and waited. Sure enough, that same black car pulled into the driveway around midnight. I watched as Meg stepped out, her face glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in months. It wasn't happiness meant for me. She didn't see me as I watched her walk inside. My fists clenched so hard that my nails dug into my palms. That was it. I'd had enough. When I walked into the house, she was already in bed. I stood in the doorway of our room, staring at her sleeping face, and felt nothing but cold, hard anger. Tomorrow, everything would change. I wasn't going to let her keep making a fool of me. By the time I sat down in the living room, I knew exactly what I was going to do. There would be no more waiting, no more watching. It was time to pull the rug out from under her. If she thought she was safe, if she thought she could keep playing this game, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The next morning, I woke up with a fire burning inside me. Meg had made her choices, and now it was my turn. I wasn't going to be the guy who sat back and let his life unravel while she laughed behind my back. No. If she wanted to betray me, there were going to be consequences. I spent the morning gathering everything I needed. The videos, the photos, the messages on Tristan's phone. I had it all saved. I called my lawyer and explained the situation. He listened carefully, then laid out my options. I could file for divorce immediately, citing adultery, and sue Meg for damages. In our state, infidelity could have serious financial consequences for the cheating party, especially when one spouse's actions harm the other's business or reputation. That was all I needed to hear. I told him to draw up the paperwork. I wanted this done as fast as possible. After that, I headed to the gym. I wasn't in the mood to deal with clients, but I knew I had to keep up appearances for now. Meg was already there when I arrived, chatting with one of the trainers. She gave me a casual wave like everything was fine. My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to nod back. Around midday, Tristan showed up. Just seeing him walk through the door made my blood boil. He had this smug look on his face, like he owned the place. I watched him make his way across the gym, nodding at a few people before heading to the weights. Meg wasn't far behind. She caught his eye and smiled, that smile. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked straight over to him. My footsteps must have caught his attention because he turned around just as I got to him. I didn't say a word. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the nearest wall. The entire gym froze. Tristan stammered, trying to say something, but I didn't let him. I shoved him harder, my voice low and cold as I told him I knew everything. I told him about the texts, the photos, the late-night rides. His eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. Meg rushed over, trying to pull me back, but I shook her off. I turned to her, my voice rising as I demanded to know how long this had been going on. She started stammering excuses, but I wasn't interested in hearing them. The truth was out now, and nothing she said could undo what she'd done. By now, one of my trainers had stepped in, trying to calm me down. I let go of Tristan and backed away, but my hands were still clenched into fists. I told him he had 30 seconds to get out of my gym before I called the cops. He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his things and bolted for the door, his face pale. Meg tried to follow him, but I stepped in her path. I told her we were done. She could pack her things and leave tonight, or I'd do it for her. She tried to argue, but I cut her off, pulling out my phone and showing her the videos and texts I'd saved. Her face went white. "You think I'm stupid?" I said, my voice low but shaking with anger. "You thought you could get away with this? In my gym? In my house?" She started crying, but I didn't care. Whatever we had was over. Later that day, I filed the divorce papers. I also made sure to include the evidence of her infidelity, knowing it would strengthen my case. My lawyer told me I could pursue damages for emotional distress and financial harm to my business. I told him to go for it. I didn't care how messy this got. Meg had crossed the line, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The hours after filing the divorce papers felt like the longest of my life. My head was spinning, replaying every moment that had led to this point. The gym, the car, Tristan's smug face. I couldn't shut it off. Every time I thought I'd reached my limit, a new wave of anger would crash over me. When I got home that evening, Meg was waiting for me. Her suitcase was by the door, and she looked like she'd been crying. I didn't feel even a shred of pity. She said she didn't know what to say, that she was sorry, that she never meant for things to get so out of hand. I cut her off. I told her the papers were filed, that she'd be hearing from my lawyer. I reminded her of the messages, the videos, and every lie she'd told me. She started begging, actually begging, saying we could fix this, that she didn't want to lose me. But it wasn't love I saw in her eyes. It was fear. Fear of losing the life we'd built together, the security I'd given her. I told her to leave. I wasn't interested in her excuses or her apologies. She hesitated, probably thinking I'd give in, but when she realized I was serious, she grabbed her suitcase and walked out the door. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day at the gym, I tried to focus on work, but it was impossible. Everyone was talking about what had happened the day before. Clients kept giving me looks, whispering when they thought I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't long before one of my trainers pulled me aside and told me Tristan had been trash-talking me. Apparently, he was telling people I'd overreacted, that Meg had been unhappy for years and I hadn't been treating her right. He even claimed the messages and videos weren't what they looked like, that they were just playful banter. That was the final straw. I left the gym early and went straight to Tristan's apartment. I didn't care about appearances or consequences anymore. When he opened the door, his smug expression instantly vanished. I stepped inside before he could say a word, slamming the door behind me. He started to say something, but I cut him off. My fist connected with his jaw before I even realized I'd swung it. He stumbled back, clutching his face, and I grabbed him by the collar, pinning him against the wall. "You think this is a game?" I snarled. "You think you can just walk into my life, take what's mine, and walk away like nothing happened?" He tried to push me off, but I shoved him harder, my voice rising with every word. "You lied. You cheated. You humiliated me in front of everyone. And now you have the nerve to act like the victim." Tristan started shouting for me to calm down, but I wasn't done. I let go of him and stepped back, my fists clenched. "You've already destroyed my marriage," I said. "Don't make me destroy you too." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face pale. Then, without another word, he nodded and backed away, clearly too scared to fight back. I left his apartment, my heart pounding. Part of me felt relieved, like I'd finally taken control of the situation. But another part of me knew I'd crossed a line. When I got back to the gym, I sat in my office, staring at the divorce papers on my desk. This wasn't just about Meg or Tristan anymore. This was about rebuilding what they tried to tear down. My business, my reputation, my life. And I wasn't going to stop until I got it all back. After that confrontation with Tristan, I expected some sort of retaliation, but the days that followed were eerily quiet. Meg hadn't contacted me, Tristan stayed out of the gym, and for a moment, it felt like I had regained control. But I knew it wouldn't last. The whispers at the gym hadn't died down. People were talking, speculating about what had happened, and it was clear the drama had spilled out into the open. Some clients avoided eye contact, while others asked vague, probing questions, trying to piece the story together. By midweek, I got a call from my lawyer. Tristan had filed a police report, claiming I assaulted him at his apartment. My lawyer said the charges were unlikely to stick since there were no witnesses and Tristan had no solid evidence, but the fact that he had gone to the authorities was a move I should have seen coming. That evening, Meg called me. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. She started off with an apology, again, saying she regretted everything and wanted to talk. But I could hear the edge in her voice, like there was more she wasn't saying. And then she dropped the bombshell. Tristan was considering filing a restraining order against me, claiming I was a threat to him and to her. She said she didn't want things to escalate further, that it would be better for everyone if I let it go. The nerve of her, asking me to back down after everything they'd done. I told her to go ahead, to let him file it if he thought he had a case. But I warned her that if they wanted to play this game, I wasn't going to sit quietly and take it. I reminded her of the evidence I had, the texts, the videos, the explicit messages, and told her that I wasn't afraid to use them if they tried to drag me through the mud. Her tone changed immediately. She went from apologetic to defensive, accusing me of being vindictive, of trying to ruin her life. I couldn't help but laugh. "Ruin your life?" I said. "You did that all on your own." I hung up before she could respond. The next day, Tristan's move became clear. He had posted a long, self-pitying message on social media, painting himself as the victim. He wrote about how he'd been unfairly attacked by someone who couldn't handle rejection, how he was dealing with injuries, and how he hoped to heal from the trauma. I was livid. Not only was he twisting the truth, but he was also trying to gain sympathy while I was the one picking up the pieces of a broken marriage. The post got a lot of attention, with dozens of comments offering support and speculating about who he was talking about. That's when I decided to make my own move. I contacted my lawyer and asked him to expedite the divorce proceedings. I wanted this over with as quickly as possible, and I wanted to make sure Meg couldn't come after the gym or any of my assets. At the same time, I started preparing for damage control at the gym. Tristan's little stunt on social media was bound to cause problems, and I needed to address it head-on. I called a staff meeting, explaining the situation without going into too much detail. I told them that personal matters had spilled into the workplace and that I was handling it legally. Some of them looked uncomfortable, but others nodded in support. A few of my trainers even pulled me aside afterward to tell me they had my back. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small win in a battle that was far from over. By the end of the week, the dust had started to settle, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Tristan wasn't done, and neither was Meg. They had already crossed so many lines, and I had no doubt they would try to push further. But if they thought I was going to sit back and let them win, they didn't know me at all. The silence didn't last. By the weekend, things were boiling over again, and this time, Tristan made sure to escalate it further. I woke up Saturday morning to find a barrage of messages on my phone. Screenshots, links, and texts from friends and clients. Tristan had doubled down on his victim act, sharing vague but pointed posts about how toxic masculinity had led to violence against him and how he was seeking legal remedies to protect himself. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots. My name wasn't mentioned outright, but enough details pointed back to me. The whispers at the gym turned into outright questions. Some clients even canceled their memberships, saying they didn't want to get involved in the drama. That was the moment I realized Tristan wasn't just coming for my pride, he was coming for my livelihood. He was using this situation to paint himself as a martyr, hoping to destroy my reputation and, by extension, the gym I'd worked so hard to build. I wasn't going to let that happen. I spent the rest of the day working with my lawyer to draft a response. If Tristan wanted to play dirty, I was ready to hit back harder. By that evening, I'd sent out a formal cease and desist letter, warning him that his posts were defamatory and that any further attempts to tarnish my reputation would be met with legal action. My lawyer assured me that we had a strong case, especially since I had the evidence to back up my side of the story. At the same time, I made my own move online. I wasn't about to air every detail, but I posted a carefully worded statement addressing the situation. I didn't name names, but I made it clear that false accusations were being spread and that I was taking steps to protect myself and my business. The response was immediate. Friends, clients, and even some strangers flooded the post with support, saying they knew the truth would come out. But that wasn't enough. I knew Tristan was only part of the problem. Meg was still out there, likely feeding him information and playing the victim in her own way. If she thought she could walk away from this unscathed, she was about to learn otherwise. That night, I made a decision. I took the explicit messages and videos Meg had sent to Tristan, the ones I'd found on his phone, and forwarded them to her family. Her parents, her siblings, even her closest cousin. I kept the message simple. I thought you should see this. Ask Meg to explain. It was a brutal move, but I didn't feel guilty. She had burned every bridge with me, and now it was her turn to face the fallout. The next morning, the calls started pouring in. First, her sister, then her mom. I didn't answer any of them. By mid-afternoon, I got a text from Meg, full of rage and desperation. She accused me of ruining her life, of humiliating her in front of her family. But I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in her guilt or her anger. She'd made her choices, and now she had to deal with the consequences. The day after that, I heard from one of her close friends, someone who had always been kind to me. She told me Meg was falling apart and begged me to back off, saying I'd made my point. Had I made my point? Maybe. But it didn't feel like enough. Not yet. At the gym, things were slowly stabilizing. My staff rallied around me, helping to reassure clients and keep the business running smoothly. A few people even came back after hearing my side of the story, apologizing for jumping to conclusions. But I wasn't done. Tristan and Meg had tried to take everything from me. My marriage, my reputation, my career. They thought they could control the narrative, but now, I was taking it back. And I wasn't going to stop until they felt the same pain they'd put me through. The days following my post were like a breath of fresh air after weeks of suffocating tension. My statement had worked, and people were starting to see through Tristan's lies. Messages of support kept rolling in. Clients, friends, and even a few acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to say they had my back. It wasn't just the gym that was bouncing back. I was too. For the first time in what felt like forever, I stopped feeling like a victim. Instead of letting Tristan and Meg's betrayal define me, I began focusing on what mattered. Myself, my business, and my future. I started doubling down on the gym, putting in the effort to not just keep it running but to make it better than ever. I introduced new programs, revamped the layout, and even launched a social media campaign to rebuild the brand. People noticed. Membership started climbing again, slowly but steadily. My staff, who had stood by me through everything, seemed energized by the changes. Clients who'd been on the fence about staying came back, saying they appreciated my honesty and resilience. Even outside the gym, I was making changes. I stopped checking Meg's social media and ignored every attempt she made to contact me. At first, she kept texting, apologies, accusations, promises to change. Then, when she realized I wasn't responding, her messages turned desperate. I need to talk to you. Please, just one chance. I'll do anything to fix this. I deleted every single one without replying. As for Tristan, he went radio silent after receiving the cease and desist letter. My lawyer assured me we had scared him off, and judging by the lack of new posts, it seemed like the message had finally gotten through. With them out of the picture, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was like I was finally free to focus on myself and what came next. One night, as I sat in the now quiet living room, I realized I didn't just want to bounce back, I wanted to start over. The house, the gym, the routines. All of it reminded me of Meg, of everything we'd built together and how easily she'd thrown it away. I didn't want that baggage anymore. So, I started making plans. I sold the house, using the money to invest in the gym and set aside a fund for myself. I packed up everything that mattered. Photos, keepsakes, the things that reminded me of who I was before all this, and left the rest behind. By the end of the month, I was living in a small apartment downtown, just a short walk from the gym. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like a clean slate. A chance to build something new, something that wasn't tied to the past. The first morning in my new place, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window and realized I hadn't felt this calm in years. No tension, no drama, just peace. I went for a run that day, something I hadn't done in months. As I jogged through the city, I thought about everything that had happened, from the moment I saw Meg step out of that black car to the day I signed the divorce papers. It had been a whirlwind of pain and anger, but now, it felt like a distant memory. Meg and Tristan had taken so much from me, but they hadn't taken everything. I still had my gym, my health, my future. And most importantly, I still had myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. It was mine to create. No more lies, no more betrayal. Just me, moving forward. And that was enough. The shift in my life wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Day by day, I found myself letting go of the bitterness that had weighed me down. It wasn't about forgetting what happened. Those scars would always be there. But I realized that holding on to anger only kept me tied to the very people who had hurt me. I wasn't about to give them that kind of power anymore. One of the biggest changes came from focusing on myself again. For years, I'd poured everything into my marriage and my business, often neglecting my own needs in the process. Now, for the first time, I put myself at the center. I started training harder, not just to stay in shape but because it made me feel alive. I also took up new hobbies, things I'd always been curious about but never made time for. I joined a hiking group that met every weekend, exploring trails I never knew existed just outside the city. The physical challenge, the fresh air, the camaraderie. It reminded me there was a whole world out there beyond the four walls of my gym. And then there was the day I decided to give back. It started small. A local high school had reached out, asking if I'd consider hosting a free fitness workshop for their students. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I had the energy to take on something new, but the principal's enthusiasm convinced me to try. The workshop was held on a Saturday morning in the school's gymnasium. About 20 kids showed up, most of them looking more interested in their phones than the workout. But as I got into it, showing them how to move, explaining why fitness mattered, it was like something clicked. By the end of the session, the kids were engaged, asking questions, even challenging each other to friendly competitions. A few stayed after to thank me, saying they'd never thought about fitness the way I explained it. One kid, shy and lanky, told me he'd been too nervous to join his school's track team but was going to give it a shot now. That moment hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd felt stuck in my own mess, drowning in anger and betrayal. But here was this kid, taking a step towards something bigger because of a few hours I'd spent with him. On the drive home, I couldn't stop smiling. It was a reminder of why I started this journey in the first place. Not just to build a business but to help people. From that day on, I made it a mission to give back. I started hosting monthly workshops, working with local schools and community centers to make fitness accessible to everyone. It wasn't about money, it was about making a difference. The positivity started spreading into every part of my life. My gym flourished, with new members coming in not just because of the equipment but because of the atmosphere. My staff stepped up, taking pride in being part of something meaningful. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. At one of the community workshops, I met someone. Her name was Emma, and she was a physical therapist who had volunteered to help out. She wasn't flashy or over the top, just warm, kind, and genuinely interested in helping people. We started talking after the workshop, first about fitness and then about life. She'd been through her own struggles, losing her father to illness and working tirelessly to support her family. But despite it all, she had this quiet strength that drew me in. Over time, our conversations turned into coffee dates, and coffee dates turned into something more. Emma wasn't like anyone I'd met before. She didn't care about appearances or trying to impress anyone. She just wanted to make the world a little better, one person at a time. Being with her felt easy, natural, like I didn't have to prove anything. She accepted me for who I was, flaws and all, and that was something I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking back at what I'd lost. I was looking forward to what was ahead. And for the first time in years, I was truly happy.